Okay. Hello, my dear students. A very good morning to you all. I'm your very own Rahul sir, and welcome to the third part of the chapter Visit to the Mansion for Standard 4. Today is the last part of this chapter. Today we will wrap up this chapter. But before that, let's have a quick recap. In this chapter, the last part, we studied that Joe March finally reaches to Laurie's house, means Laurie's mansion, and she brings few things along with her, like Blemminge, like kittens. We also come to know about few more characters who were Meg and Beth, who were the sisters of Joe March, what each of them sent for Laurie. And finally, we read that Laurie tries to please Joe March, but Joe March denies and asks her to take rest. Now, finally, if you have book, pay attention to your book. If not, pay attention to the screen. The pretty one is Meg, and the curly haired one is Amy, I believe. Now, who is the speaker of this line? This line has been spoken by Laurie, and he asks Joe March that I think the pretty one is Meg, and the curly haired one is Amy. Amy means Amy is another sister of Joe March. Laurie paused. He then added shyly. Shyly means he was speaking hesitantly. Understood? I often hear you talking to each other. Sometimes when I see you all sitting around the table with your mother, it's like looking at the picture. Now, here Laurie says Joe March that sometimes he peeps into their window, into their bedroom, and sees and finds that they are talking together with their mother. And when they do such, it looks basically like a beautiful picture. You can see this description in the picture below given. Laurie poked the fire to hide the sudden trembling of his lips. Now, we all know that in foreign countries it's chilly cold, and every house has got a fireplace, and in that fireplace only Laurie poked the fire. Means maybe the fire was low, and to make the room more hotter, Laurie basically poked the fire. Understood? Joe was touched. Joe was touched means listening to this line from Laurie, she felt very bad. Not bad in a negative way, but bad in a positive way. She thought that how they enjoy with their family and how Laurie remains very silent, very dull, very sad. Understood? While he was unwell and lonely, she was happy at home with her mother and sisters. Joe March thinks the same thing, that when Laurie was lying alone in his mansion at that very time, Joe March was enjoying with her mother and sisters. They were enjoying, they were talking to each other. You could just come and visit us, she said gently. Joe March says that why don't you come inside the house? When you saw us talking, why don't you came inside the house and started talking with us? Mother would be glad to welcome you, and you will have jolly times with my sisters and me. Wouldn't your grandpa let you? Joe March says again that if you would enter the house, if you would come to my house, my mother will be glad to see you. She would welcome you. She would love to welcome you. Don't your grandpa allows you to come out of the mansion? I think he would if I asked. Now Laurie answers and says that I think if I asked my grandpa, he would surely allow me. He would surely allow me. He is very kind, but he thinks I might disturb strangers, said Laurie. Now, here, Laurie says that my grandfather is very kind. Of course, he will allow me when I ask him. But he thinks that if I go to other's house, brother, I would disturb them because I don't have that habit of talking to strangers. We are not strangers, we are your neighbors, and you won't disturb us. Joe March says Laurie. That no? Who told you that we are strangers for you? We are your neighbors, and you will never disturb us. I believe that. Then Joe and Laurie started talking about books. Now, this topic was changed and they started talking about different books. Joe was delighted to find that Laurie also loved books and had read more books than her. Now, Joe March felt very happy that as Joe March has a craze about different books, loving different books, Laurie also has a craze equal to Joe March and he has read more books than Joe March. Now, coming to the last page, my dear students. If you like them so much, come down to our library, Laurie offered. Grandpa isn't home, don't be afraid. Now here, Laurie cracks a joke on Joe March and says, don't be afraid. If you want, you can come to the library. Grandpa is not at home. I am not afraid of anything, Joe replied, tossing her head. Now Joe felt actually bad. And she said that, no, who told you that I am afraid of anyone? I am not. Laurie laughed and led her through the rooms. Laurie laughed and he took Joe March to the library. He let her examine whatever struck her fancy. Now, Joe March was moving back to back Laurie, and Laurie was showing different rooms as he knew that Joe March thought very much about this mansion. She had a fancy about this mansion. And today is the day when Joe March had to discover all her fancies. At last, they reached the library where Joe clapped her hands and danced with delight. It was lined with books. Means as they reached the library, they both felt, especially Joe March felt very happy to see the library. She clapped her hands and danced with delight. And then there were pictures and statues, strange like tables and bronze pieces. My dear students, in exams, a question might come, what different things Joe March saw inside the library. Means this you need to note that she saw different pictures, statues, strange little tables and bronze pieces. And best of all, a great open fireplace with quaint tiles all around. Quaint tiles means tiles which were of old-fashioned tiles basically. What richness, sighed Joe. Now, Joe was surprised. She was appreciating the decoration of the library, What richness, sighed Joe, sitting into a chair and gazing around her. Means whatever she was saying, she was feeling surprised and she was gazing all around the place. Theodore Lawrence, you should be the happiest boy in the world. What is this Theodore Lawrence? Theodore Lawrence is the full name of Laurie. And she says that of course you must be the happiest boy in the world. And why she says so? Because she has never seen so much of fancy in her life. Which basically Laurie is enjoying. Laurie is having that privilege to enjoy those fancies actually. Understood? No one can live on books, said Laurie, shaking his head as he perched on a table. Just then a bell rang and Joe flew up, alarmed. It's your grandpa. What shall I do? Now, Laurie replies to Joe March that, no, who told you that I am the happiest boy in this world? Nobody can be happy with books only because we human beings are social animals and we need people to talk, to share our feelings, to share our thoughts. Understood? And just then, a sound of bell ringing came from downstairs. And now Joe March was afraid and she thought that Grandpa might have arrived. Now, well, whatever it is, you said you are not afraid of anything, remember? Said Laurie, laughing. Now, Laurie started laughing and said jokingly that, no, few moments later, you only were saying that you are not afraid of anyone, anything. Now, what happened? But it was only the doctor who had come to check on Laurie. Now, who was there? It was the doctor. Understood? Means the grandpa was not there. Would you mind if I let you for a minute? Laurie asked. Now, it's a manner. It's a manner. If somebody comes to your house, you must grant permission from that guest. And that's what Laurie did. He seek permission from Joe March. Joe shook her head and went off to look at a portrait of old Mr. Lawrence. Joe gave Laurie the permission to go, and by the time she was looking into a great portrait of Mr. Lawrence, means Laurie's grandpa. She was still standing before the portrait when the door opened again. And finally, while she was looking at the portrait, the door again reopened. Joe did not turn as she said, I won't be afraid if your grandpa, he looks stern, but he has kind eyes and I like him. Means Joe March here thinks that Laurie has entered. And without turning back, she says, looking into the picture, looking into the portrait, that I believe that your grandpa is a bit stern, but he's also kind. And I can say that looking into his kind, beautiful eyes. Thank you, ma'am, said a gruff voice, said a rough voice. Somebody said thank you to Joe March behind her. And there, to Joe's great dismay, stood old Mr. Lawrence. And suddenly, when Joe turned, she saw Mr. Lawrence standing behind him. Of course, she would be afraid. Mr. Lawrence is very amused and invites Joe to tea. Mr. Lawrence didn't scold Joe March. Rather, he invited Joe March to drink tea along with him. There, as Joe and Laurie talk merrily, means happily, Mr. Lawrence realizes how lonely Laurie had been and decides to send him to Mart's house occasionally. There at the tea table, Mr. Lawrence realized that how lonely was his grandson. And then and there he decides to send Laurie to Joe Mart's house, means Mart's house, to the old brown house occasionally. Now I hope you liked this chapter, you liked my explanation. I ended my third part of this chapter. Thank you and have a good day, my dear students. Bye.